can get going then. Morning, everyone, or afternoon, or evening, or whatever it is, wherever you are. So the first item on the agenda is action item reviews. That'll be followed by the work group updates. Tomas has a request for a repository that I think we should discuss. And exit criteria. Again, we one of the action items was to start a discussion on exit criteria, which I did do, but it sort of petered out, and I think we need to figure out how we're going to move forward on that. And then, actually, maybe we should move this first, the TSC representation policy. And Mike Dolan, are you on the call? I think I saw you in the list.
Yes, I'm on.
Yeah, so and again, I think Patrick is in on behalf of Mick, but something that we didn't, that wasn't written into the bylaws, the governance, was any notion of a proxy for the purposes of representing somebody either on the board or on the TSC. And Mike, do you want to sort of go into some of the history and essentially how we handle this in other groups? I know that many people who may have participated in standards organizations are accustomed to having the ability to sort of proxy or have somebody come in and serve as an alternate. But we haven't been doing that in the Linux Foundation. And Mike, maybe you could just sort of give a little history and background.
Yeah, it's not typical for us to have alternates in terms of voting alternates if there's something that's up for vote. So that's why a lot of times our TSCs actually use email for voting just in case somebody can't make it. Mm-hmm. And so that's one way to resolve the issue of alternates, because anybody can join this call. So it's not.
That's right.
It's not like it's just open to TSC members. And so anybody can join in, call, and talk, participate. Obviously, if you've been on calls prior to this week, it's pretty wide open in terms of, getting everybody to chime in. In terms of voting, though, that's usually where they do like to have the person at the meeting, where it becomes more of an issue. So in this first initial startup phase, the first 6 months that's in the charter, it's by representation of the
right.
premier member. So from that perspective, if the TSC wants, I think the key thing is just for the TSC to agree on how you want to handle this, instead of, because Todd came to me and asked me, hey, how do we handle alternates on this project for this? This is where it's up to the TSC if you guys can just, come together on agreement on how you're going to handle alternates, and I would look at it in two phases, both in the startup phase, the first 6 months, and then going on after. Because in an open source project, here's where the issue comes up. So somebody is, say, the lead of a project or elected to the TSC because of their leadership on a particular project. What happens if they can't make it? Should they be allowed to just send somebody else from their company? Or should it be something where an alternate comes from the project that they're involved with? And so, that becomes the issue. In a standards body, it's typical to send an alternate from your company as a proxy, because you're basically signing up as a company for votes, and that's how it works. In an open source project, that is not the norm. The norm is that if somebody can't make it, then it should be somebody else from the project, is the norm of what we usually see. And so we're in this weird 6 month phase where it is more like probably more like a standards body, but after that 6 months, I think you don't want to have the same expectation going forward. And it would be good for the TSC to clarify this before we get to that 6 month window.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that was just kind of great.
Right. And
but
yeah, that's, and so thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. Basically what I wanted to have a discussion of here, and maybe even get an agreement, from my perspective, I think that this first 6 months is definitely sort of an outlier. We set it up so that each of the premier members would have a seat on the TSC for the first 6 months, and then after that, we're looking for people who have been contributing into the community, and they're they would be nominated and potentially elected into the TSC, and that's based on their individual merit. And so they're just as you would get a commit bit based on your individual merit, I think the same applies to the TSC. It's an individual. If we have, one of the functions of the TSC is going to be that a project lead would be automatically represented on the TSC, but then there would be others that are elected. So I think as Mike suggests, that it's probably wise if we come up with a formal representation policy and then take a vote on that. I'm not suggesting that we do that right now and today, but just get people to sort of weigh in on whether they agree with roughly what was outlined, which is that we would permit it at least for this first 6 months, which is actually we only have about 2 months, 4 months left rather, but and then after that, after we have the election and we have a duly elected TSC, that we would from that point on, it would be if you're on the TSC, you either have to be in the meeting or and if we don't reach quorum, we can't take any kind of votes and so forth, and we'll have to take it to mailing list as Mike suggested. Any comments or thoughts on that?
This is Vipin. How often will this TSC membership from the contributors be evaluated? Meaning, if let's say that you have 11 members or 12 members or who are from the contributors, the project leads, the maintainers, and so on. Now, if one or more of them do not show up for a considerable number of meetings, let's say 3 or 4 in a row, then what happens? I mean, in other words, for whatever reason, I can think of many reasons why people will not show up. So then, does the business of the TSC go on in spite of a lack of quorum, or does it continue?
Well, it depends on.
If it becomes a quorum issue, you can certainly discuss it. I should have also said that many of our TSCs don't have any alternate option available. So their expectation is that we're scheduling around 10 or so people, and they should make every effort to be there. And if they can't be there, the agenda, they should generally know what's on the agenda and weigh in ahead of time. And typically, we do take votes offline and via email anyway, so it's not usually that big of a deal to miss one meeting, but it does get disruptive if somebody is not showing up to any meeting. And certainly you can evaluate what policy you want to, how you want to handle that.
So Chris was asking, Christopher Allen was asking in chat whether we are always going to have weekly meetings. I doubt it. I think once things settle down, it'll probably be every other week or something like that. Whatever seems natural. But in the bootstrap mode, obviously, there's an awful lot that we have, still to cover, and so I think for a while, at least, we'll be going with weekly. And then, Vipin, to your point, I know a number of standards bodies also have some sort of a policy that 3 strikes and you're out kind of thing, and you lose your voting privileges. And that's but that's typically when it's representation by a company, and there's also an opportunity for an alternate. And so in that kind of a situation, it's actually much more egregious, right? But since we can do things like, yeah, exactly, OASIS allows for leaves of absence, W3C does as well. And typically what happens is, the chair will reach out and say, hey, you haven't showed up for a while. What's the deal? Give them a chance to get back on track. And if they don't, then oftentimes the best way is just to coach somebody to say, hey, if you really can't do it because you have too much on your plate in your day job or whatever, then maybe you could step aside and somebody else could be elected. And I think that's probably the best way to handle it, is either the chair or somebody from Linux Foundation can coach somebody either to get back into participation or gracefully step aside. So I guess what I could do is I could take an action to draft up a policy that we could use for the first, for the remainder of the first 6 months while we're by members at the premier level, and then we would basically have it be, that there would be no alternate except for projects. But there wouldn't be an alternate on an individual basis because they're representing themselves. That make sense?
Good.
Anybody disagree with that course of action? Okay, I'll take an action then, Todd, if you wouldn't mind recording that, and I'll draft up a policy and we can cover it next week. Bring it up to vote, rather. Okay, action item review. So, Todd, the first one is the tooling meeting, which is going to be held right after this, and I'm bad because I forgot to spam the list again.
Yep, the call-in details were sent out with the agenda that went out yesterday, and you can just surf to the wiki on GitHub for the exact dial-in details.
So anybody who's interested will be having a meeting with the infrastructure team, and we'll be discussing, getting Garrett stood up, getting Travis integrated, and so forth, and various other things that need to be done to get us fully up and running from an infrastructure perspective. And so that'll be immediately following this call, unless we end early, in which case it'll be at 8:30 a.m. Pacific. And then the next update, Todd, would be the technical face-to-face. I think we have results from the doodle poll.
Yeah, so in terms of dates, looking at the Thursday and Friday right after consensus at the beginning of May is looking like the best. I'm chatting with a few companies right now that can potentially host space for us. I'm hoping to close on an answer by end of day today so we can get that move forward. Just waiting to hear back there.
All right, we can be able to sort of close that up then on the mailing list in Slack so that we can get a registration set going soon?
Yep, exactly.
Okay. All right, thank you. Next up was Dave Vole to finalize the wording of the white paper draft 01 or 0.1 rather to get in front of the board. How's that going, Dave?
Yeah, so it's probably going to be a couple more weeks before we have our first draft done, to be honest. So, we discussed in our working group meeting yesterday that we want to be able to devote a full session to having, here it is, let's go through it one more time, make sure that we're ready to, generate that PDF off of the Google Doc and post it on the site. Basically that first draft is what we want to be able to put out there, and then, there's going to be that one section that talks about public versus private that we just want to highlight. So they could see the first draft, they'll be able to zoom in on that one. That's the only thing that we had actually identified that we just want to make sure that we're all on the same page on. And So that's likely going to be, a couple more weeks before that's ready.
Okay. All right. So then Todd, let's just amend this to skip a week, and then so it'll be due the 28th, I guess.
Yeah. Well.
No. What's today?
See where we're at.
May something or other. Yeah. Right.
May 5th.
Okay. I can't. Oh, for crying out loud. Here. Where was I? Oh, next up is Patrick to set up the STL repository. Patrick, what's the ETA on that?
So we'll have that done by the next meeting.
Okay. All right. And is somebody going to be able to attend the infrastructure meeting that we have next? Because I think it's important that we at least have somebody from Intel there to understand what we're going to be doing. Or
I will be attending as much as I can.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. And the last one was for me to start a discussion on exit criteria, which I did. I created a Slack channel, and there was some discussion, but we need more, and we need to start getting a little bit more serious, because I think people are going to want to start pushing for things. But if we don't have any exit criteria, it's going to be hard to evaluate graduation from incubation. There's somebody on a phone that's a lot of background noise. Could they go on mute, please?
Chris, I'm just going to mute all lines, and then if you want to come off mute.
Okay. Thanks, Todd. Okay, work group updates. Patrick, you're up first.
Okay. We all held our first regular meeting on Monday, and Primrose walked us through the counterfeit drug use case. In that process, we recognized several improvements that could be made to the use case template, and I've made those. The next meeting is Monday, where we're going to walk through the requirements section. We didn't even get to the requirements section. We just got to the use case description and some other areas, the upper part of the document. So this week we're going to walk through, not on the counterfeit drugs use case, but just in general, what are the requirements we're collecting for any use case. If you know people with skills in writing use cases and requirements, please send them to us. And that's it.
Except I'm on mute again. All right, thanks, Patrick. Ram, you're up next. You may need to come off mute.
Hi guys, sorry, just came off mute. So we had our initial kickoff meeting the previous Friday. We had very decent participation, and we decided that we would have regular meetings bi-weekly, starting next Wednesday, 9 a.m. Pacific. So we had a discussion about the tools that we're going to use, and we decided to use Slack as the primary communication channel. Also, one of the things was the list of issues that we wanted to discuss. We had about 7 or 8 topics that we could get started on while we wait for the requirements group to kind of come through with the the requirements track. So we're going to get started with some of those, starting to discuss those. So we had a good kickoff, other than some WebEx problems. But we managed to get through that. So that's where we are. And thanks to Chris Allen for helping me with that. That's about it.
And I get on mute. Awesome. Thank you very much, Ram. Next up is Dave, and I guess Dave, you basically gave your status, but maybe anything you didn't already cover.
Well, yeah, I'd say most of the meeting we had yesterday, we were reviewing Renat's proposal for feedback, and so we were able to put together the right process, procedure, forms, and we all agreed that that's the right process, so it was all accepted, and thank you, Renat, for all that. Basically, what we're going to do is, when we do post our first draft, we're going to include the link we're going to be using a form, Google Forms, and Google Forms has, so there's a form that people will fill out. They provide an editor's view, so we'll be able to have a list of all of the people that have provided feedback on our drafts as we publish them. And then a portion of our weekly working group meeting is going to be dedicated to reviewing the feedback for updates into the white paper. So that was an accomplishment. We got all that figured out, and then just proceeded with additional reviews and edits to the white paper. So that's pretty much what we did yesterday.
All right, thanks, Dave. Chris Allen, Identity.
Yes, so we had our kickoff meeting on last week. We did have a discussion about, well, first off, we had 32 people show up during the meeting, so it was very well attended. Fairly lively intro with a lot of thoughts about, where does identity fit into things. We did decide that we had some independent goals than just having it be part of the architecture or requirements working groups, that there were some things very specific to identity that people really wanted to be able to articulate and be able to move the specifications forward and such, and contribute to requirements and architecture and other groups. There is some live notes of the first session, which I posted in the chat. We are planning on meeting bi-weekly on alternative weeks from the architecture meeting, so they're bi-weekly. We will be bi-weekly. We also will be primarily using Slack. I guess the final, sort of an open question after that meeting was, one of the days we were talking about for meeting is the same day as the face-to-face. So we were kind of wanting to know how the face-to-face agenda might work, and is it possible for us to have the identity meeting during that with some kind of call support. That's it.
Thanks, Chris. Let's see, and finally me, the Continuous Integration Working Group. We're meeting in about an hour, and we'll give you an update next week. There's not much to talk about yet. Okay, and I don't know if I'll be leading it, but I'm cat herding it anyway for now. Next up is Tomas. Tomas, you had sent out a request for a repository and some naming. Maybe you could review some of that and the motivation, the rationale behind it, and then we can get into a discussion on that.
I'd like to create a GitHub repository within the Hyperledger. This would contain a subset of digital assets proposed code base, so that we can build the joint proposal that we created on the hackathon on the last face-to-face, just by using Hyperledger repositories. The code I would move there defines a generic data access interface to the blockchain. It implements key generation, transaction composition, account level aggregation of UTXOs. And this code, this is the code that we actually connected to OBC. The code repository would build a Java artifact, that basically a Java jar, that would be then included into the build of the fabric to build a joint proposal. This repository, this piece of the digital asset code, is also a piece that we use in our own internal development in creating solutions for our clients. So we know that that API is helpful, probably helpful for others, and that is why I suggested to name this repository API and move that code. But this is basically the suggestion, and I'm waiting for comments.
Hi, Tomas. This is Dave Hall. I sort of thought this was a natural output from the agreement on the code base anyway. Is this a change in plan versus on how that your code would be represented in that was originally discussed and being represented in the repo?
It is not a change to the discussion. I think it is the natural way to implement it. The wording of the original proposal was not explicit about this, and I thought that it would be better to bring this up so there is no confusion, or that nobody feels hurt by the kind of setup and setting up another repository.
So I'd like to ask, this is Patrick, I'd like to ask the same question a different way. Does the Fabric repo that's in Hyperledger today include this code?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't because... Yep.
The purpose of Fabric was to incubate the code that had been developed in the face-to-face, which included the digital assets.
No, the face-to-face did not actually created a repo that would have included both code bases. On the face-to-face, we were building from two distinct repositories, and we were connecting the resulting services with each other.
Okay.
Thomas, this is Stefan. How would that code interact with the code that's currently known as Fabric? Via the interface, or would you code it indirectly?
This code would be connected to the Fabric through an implementation of a gRPC connection between the two, because they are two distinct technologies. So this would be a connection between services, yes, the same way as we had in the
As it's your blockchain, could that be seen as an interaction between two independent blockchains, or how is that to be understood then?
No, the code that we contribute here in this repository is not an implementation of a blockchain. It is an implementation of an application development API and utility functions to use a blockchain.
Okay, it's your client layer then, as you called it in the face-to-face.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
So Richard here. So I mean, that seems sensible. My only request would be it's just as Fabric is unhelpful as a top-level project here, and maybe we need to get onto the README, which I've not been paying attention to, but it should, I think actually maybe Christopher Allen saying the same point in the chat, it shouldn't be called API at the top level. It's associated with one of the projects under incubation and should be scoped accordingly.
Yeah. So, and you know, again, my concern was, I guess, there's sort of twofold. One is the sort of the generic name, and the second is just the complexity of the build increases, because now you've got to deal with submodules bumping, and you know, when you submit a pull request to one, it doesn't test the other, and so forth. It just it makes for a much more difficult CI pipeline to manage when we start having multiple things that need to be assembled from multiple repositories. But I think, Tomas, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that we also were going to sort of start with this approach, but then gradually merge into the Fabric repository so that we could have a single repository to build and test against. Is that still?
There are different technical motivations for why this setup is as I'm just suggesting. For one, these are really distinct technologies. So creating a common build script, even if we would move them into the same repository, they would probably use entirely different build mechanisms, and it would still build two distinct artifacts that are connected as individual services. So it might look optically more related, but the actual technical process would not change at all. And the second reason is that this is certainly a work in progress, and this piece of code is part of our current stack and our internal stack that we're working on, and this is the simplest way to separate and enable us to be able to maintain both code bases, at least until the Hyperledger Foundation's creates a solution that allows us to replace our internal effort. We hope that this will happen quickly, and as soon as we are converging and as soon as it looks like we are near to it, there is no problem in moving this repository, this code into that target repository. But at this very moment, having this code inside another build with other build scripts would pose a significant effort on our side to merge code back and forth between the two supported stacks of digital asset. And this would not only be a bigger effort on our side, but I think that this would also not be beneficial for the community, because it would mean that our capabilities of moving code between the two would be limited by resources, and probably it wouldn't be as vital and living a repository than if we manage to run the two in parallel with a shared repository. Did this explain the motivation? And I heard that there are concerns about the generic name API. I could also imagine that we call it by the technology as Java API, or we call it by the currently proposed Fabric connection, Fabric API. I don't know what people would prefer.
So is it at this point that it will only work with the Fabric repository, or do you feel like this is going to be something that would be useful if Sawtooth Lake moves forward or a third incubation thing moves forward?
Well, we currently aim to support the joint proposal. This library, however, contains useful functions. It defines a very generic, on the same time, use-proven access to a blockchain. It is an open source project. People are free to do with it what they think it's suitable for. I think it has utility functions that might be interesting, and maybe it helps to create or helps to speed up other developments too. But it's currently not our focus.
Right.
Hi. I would say it should be renamed as DAH_. whatever dash Java API, because for clients, some of our interfaces could be, something else other than a Java interface. They could be a JavaScript, Node.js, REST, JSON interface, as opposed to the proposed DAH Java API interface. So this, right, currently as it is, only talks to the what was tested from IBM, the OBC from IBM, but then somebody needs to also look at the Intel APIs, right, and how to access them. So this is just my 2 cents. Could be DH/Java-API. Thank you.
This is Mike Dolphin explanation. I don't care what you guys call it, but do not use company names or trademarks in the repo names, please. Just not a good practice. Sorry.
I agree. I can see Fabric API. Yeah. That's one way we could go forward.
A test for me is when somebody who's not part of these calls or part of the project comes and lands on the top level Git repo and looks at it. We know we have to think about how we communicate what's going on and how things relate to each other. So as long as it's clear from its name that at least now it is scope 2 or works only with the BOP OBC converged code-based incubation project, and we don't yet know, or we maybe know it doesn't work with STL or anything else that comes along, then fine. So so whether it's scoped just one level down or it's got Fabric at the beginning of it, whatever, I don't really mind, but it can't be something generic, because already Fabric is generic, and I worry that's going to confuse people.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard. Chris,
this is a question for you, Chris. In regards to the CI working group and maybe the tooling working group or whatever. There's going to be a variety of people who are going to want to submit things that aren't really technically incubations, that are useful tidbits for this and that, maybe used by multiple incubations. I don't know. I mean, is there? What do you guys want? Do you absolutely want these types of things to be integrated? Are there some technical reasons why it can't, that you guys might be able to solve? I'm just wondering if this shouldn't be pushed into an action item of another group.
Yeah. So Chris, you raise a good point, and actually, there was some conversations in Slack and and elsewhere, I think, on the mailing list about people with code that they were developing and they had private repositories. I think somebody, I think it was the guy that goes by Joe Quant handle, had built a sort of a Docker, a vagrant list, if you will, procedure for standing up all the various Docker containers, and something like that. I think is fairly useful. It remains to be seen yet whether it's something that somebody wants to formally incubate, and again, it's related just to one of the currently incubating things. I tend to agree. It's like, where does that fit? If it's often somebody's private repository and somebody wants to contribute to it, that can create, some. Well, it potentially can create some problems depending on how people license it, as to whether or not they're able to contribute. Certainly, I know. I know that from an IBM perspective, we'd have to go through all the sausage grinding of getting approval to even submit a bug fix to something small like that. But if it were under the Hyperledger project in some capacity formally, and the governance of the IP and everything else was therefore part and parcel of that particular contribution, then if we had some place where people could post things that they wanted to sort of let people kick the tires on, that might be useful. But I think I think we need to sort of take a step back and think about this long and hard, because if we have something where anybody can post, well, then it's a free-for-all, and we don't necessarily want the Hyperledger project to be seen as endorsing something that's, not up to par, so to speak. And then, conversely, we would have to have some sort of a process to ensure that the licensing and so forth was commensurate with what we were expecting. So it would have to be some sort of a vetted environment, and I don't know, maybe the TSC has to approve. It's not a formal incubation proposal, but it's a formal proposal to share something under the IP terms of the Hyperledger project, for instance. I don't know, Mike, if you've got any insights from other projects and how they deal with, I don't know, they might want to call them, community projects, or I know Cloud Foundry has a Cloud Foundry community, but that's not really formally under the CFF. It's completely independent. It's just sort of there. OpenStack has StackForge, which isn't formally under the OpenStack governance, but it's basically a bunch of satellite projects, but it's a free-for-all essentially, just like the Cloud Foundry one. So I don't know, Mike, if you've got any insights.
Well, I mean, normally if the code is sizable enough that it's its own project, or some of our projects have sub-projects as well. So you can have different sub-projects. For instance, if there is a project just working on like build tools for a project, like what do you guys have, Fabric, and then you have Fabric build tools or something, as a sub-project of Fabric, some of them structure that way, where you have projects and then sub-projects, and then the only ask of the community is that they align, to at least some higher order project when they create a sub-project. Some do that. Some do the free-for-all model you just described, where they park it all in, some, community working group or something, repo. I'm not a particular fan of that, just because it is the Wild West, and if people start doing that, then instead of going to the TSC and going through a review and proposal and discussion like you're doing here, there tends to be a lot of sidestepping that, and people just go and create stuff over there because it's just easier and quicker, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but there is some value, I think, to having a community discussion around projects and things that everybody's going to work on, and try to get others to start working on things together, instead of having single group projects out in some third-party repo or community repo.
Right.
And some projects, they just force fit everything under various projects, and so if you're doing a build script tooling project, then you just do it under whichever one is most closely aligned or whatever. So I don't know. I have an answer for you guys. I'm not sure what you guys are envisioning either. So I guess it's without it. Well, it's a little hard for me to.
Right. Well, in the context of what Tomas is proposing, that's actually part and parcel of what we had originally proposed. So it's not a separate thing. It's not a new incubation. It's not a not incubation. It is the same thing. It's just it's a part. It just happens to have a separate repository. Chris Allen asked a really good question. And actually, STL has a number of different repos. I'm curious, Patrick, is the plan to move over, that collection of repositories?
No, that was actually covered last week. We felt that it didn't make sense to use more than one repository within Hyperledger.
Yeah.
So that's basically going to point to another organization where we're going to put all of the repositories.
Okay, now I'm confused. It's
okay.
Not under
so let's say we have 5 repositories. We didn't think that you would want us to create 5 repositories within Hyperledger organization. Given that Fabric is a single one, we didn't think it makes sense to create 5 for Sawtooth Lake. So we're creating we have another organization it's actually github.com/sawtoothlake, where we would put all of our repositories and then point to them from Hyperledger.
Okay, somehow or other I missed that subtlety from last week. And would you be transferring the? I guess I'm just not sure how that would work from a Linux Foundation perspective. Would you transfer the ownership of that org to the Linux Foundation? How, and just what? I guess I'm confused. And just leave a pointer in Hyperledger?
Yeah, the idea was we would create a repo in Hyperledger, but it wouldn't have much more than a README file that points people elsewhere to Sawtooth Lake.
Patrick, maybe we can work offline with you. I can get Rye from our to work with you guys to figure out how to get this working the right way. I'm not sure that that's going to be a good long-term solution, and I don't want to get to a point where people want to start working on things in that,
right.
And then we're in a weird spot. So, Todd, let's take an action item to hook up Rye and Patrick and whoever on his team,
Will do.
And we can get a solution worked out there. Is that right, Patrick?
Yes, thanks, Mike.
Okay.
Yeah. Chris Allen just in chat, the basic problem is the lack of really good ways to organize repositories. That is so true. Just a mess. Submodules basically suck. I think we probably need to take this offline because we're spending a bit of time on it, but this is the larger problem of, multiple repositories. How do we deal with non-incubated projects or, sort of side projects, if you will, or community projects, whatever you want to call them. I guess we'll have to take that one and think about it a little bit more. But in terms of the ask from Tomas, he's looking to have a separate repository, and there's a number of reasons that he cited, and so I guess I saw in the chat a couple of people suggesting Fabric-API. I'm curious, Tomas, is that something that you could live with? And then for everyone else on the call, is that something that others could live with as well, at least temporarily until we figure out a way of doing the full integration?
I can live with that. If there are no objections, then we could end this discussion with that.
Just a question. Last week when I brought Sawtooth Lake to here, I used the formal Hyperledger improvement process and document. Are we going to do that on requests like this?
Well, this isn't a new incubation proposal. It's really more of a naming problem and an organization problem, right? We had talked about doing a merge. It's still a merge. It's just that the code bases aren't fully merged. They are built independently, and they compose and they complement each other, right? I think that's the distinction.
Okay.
It's not really a different proposal, though. It's just how do you build it and how do you manage the repository. We could update the proposal to incorporate this if that seems to make sense, but
this is Stefan here. Isn't this like one part of the original proposal which we put together before we went to the face-to-face?
No, not quite, because it doesn't. Again, the proposal that we articulated, was it a month ago, I guess now, and approved, had included in it. I think there was a a diagram, an architecture diagram that showed the various pieces from the digital asset proposed contribution integrated into the OBC, right, and how they interacted with one another.
Yep.
That isn't changing, and so it's the subset of the original DAH. What was it called? DAH proposal or something like that. I can't remember now.
Yeah, exactly.
Repo. It was a subset of that we defined in that experiment, and that's what Tomas is going to be including in this repository, not the other bits that we shaded out, so to speak.
Okay. Well, with whatever subgroup is going to be doing this, I think you also need to be thinking a little bit about things like, if we have a hackathon next week, how do people do, things like that? How do people who wish to contribute, bits of code, what's their process? Somebody's got a great, XYZ, but that will apply to 5 different incubations someday.
Yeah.
How is that done?
Well, that would be done through the same process. I come up with a proposal, I ask it to be incubated, I prove its worth, I graduate it. I mean, I don't think that changes.
No, I guess maybe I'm misunderstanding something. I'm saying things that aren't. Is it true that anything that's incubated should be able to graduate to mature, as opposed to something that is, a submission that says, hey, this would be useful for Sawtooth?
That's the entry criteria. So I don't know the answer to that, Christopher. I just don't, and I'm not going to say what I think the answer should be. I think that's really for us to decide. That's why we're all here. But getting back to the original question, Tomas is asking for a repository, and I guess the suggested name is Fabric-API at this point, as opposed to just API. Are people okay with that or no?
I'm okay with that, and as Stefan, I think as we mentioned before, this, we're not carving anything in stone here. If we want to change something a little bit later, we can certainly do so. So if it helps, if it's easier for Tomas to keep the code bases in sync and we can still build off of it, it seems fine by me.
Yep.
I mean, it seems like a generic name because it seems like a lot. At least I heard another comment that somebody else wants to have a JavaScript-based API. I mean, just saying Fabric API, because it's completely Java code, you might want to call it a Java API.
Or just Fabric-Java API.
Yeah.
And it implies that the API could only be used with Fabric, which may or may not be the case. I don't know.
I'd like to drop in some other consideration. In our joint proposal, we also said that we would integrate Blockstream's script interpreter for the UTXO code. Now, once at the current on the hackathon, we did not. We also just took the binary artifacts there, but we did not actually copied this code into the repositories either. The code in question is actually a derived code out of the Bitcoin project, which is an open source project. I think that the code has a very good security properties because it is maintained by the Bitcoin community who guard their few $1 billion of tokens. Now, therefore, it makes sense to keep the link of this code with the Bitcoin code base so we can benefit of any security enhancements on any reviews that happens there. And this, if we would want to do this the way that GitHub suggests to do it, that would also imply that we would have to actually fork the Bitcoin repository into the Hyperledger to be able to link that code. I know that this would be something similar than I'm proposing here, and probably spikes us even more discussion. But it's a technical, well, technically this would be the right way to do it. So my question to the community: how do we deal with these composed projects, and how do we deal with creating repositories?
Yeah, that's probably a discussion for the next meeting, but you know, again, it's going to need a submodule link at the very least that we bump whenever it's updated, and I think it's a slippery slope, because once you start, you know, if you go down the path that Cloud Foundry, for instance, has done, where they have literally hundreds of repositories, well, over 100 anyway, and they require a team of 10 people to manage the release integration step, because there's no way to just automate a build every time somebody does a pull request to one of them. And so basically they require the whole process of doing release integration, which means that you typically are dealing with multiple commits, not single commits, when you do tests, and then you don't really know where in the code caused the build to fail, blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, we'll have to sort of...
Okay, I didn't want to hijack the conversation.
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out this is
I
a broader
understand,
topic.
but I mean, so we're sort of actually stuck here, because until we get your code actually under Hyperledger, we don't have a merge proposal right now, which is unfortunate. And you know, the sooner we can get that, the better. Again, it's not my preference that we have a separate repository, but if that's the way we have to do this initially, then I suggest that we try to do that, and probably with something that Richard was suggesting, which is to make sure that it's scoped by virtue of, and I think David will also, that it's scoped by virtue of its name, so that it's clear what this is about. And so maybe Fabric-Java API or something, maybe that's the right thing.
Okay, let's keep it simple. Let's make it Fabric API, and then if any objections, Fabric API.
Fine by me, and let's copy into the README something similar to or identical to the other one, so that it so people know what Fabric is. As in, it's the same as the other one. Yeah, fine by me. Yeah.
So there's still the subject of, yeah, there may be another API, Chris. I guess that's potentially true, but we only have one, and again, my goal would be that once we get that repository established, that we'd be looking at figuring out how we actually can merge that back into the Fabric repository, so that we have one build, potentially multiple artifacts that get built out of it, including, you know, a jar file for the Java API part. That would be my hope that we could work towards. All right, so let's do that then. I think I'm not hearing any objections, and so we'll use Fabric API, and we'll make sure that the README is appropriately annotated. So action to Tomas to make that so.
Thank you.
Thanks. Where did the... Here it is. Exit criteria. So we've been talking about this sort of obliquely, but again, we tried, taking it to Slack and having some discussion, and there was actually some good discussion by a few people. But I think we need to start making this a little bit more real, and actually getting concrete discussion on exit criteria. I'm not suggesting we do that now, but I'm going to reiterate a call that we have at least some subset of the members of the TSC willing to, and anyone else who would like, to get together at least once to go through and have a coherent discussion about exit criteria and put together at least the beginnings of a proposal that could be fleshed out maybe over Slack and email, but I do think a call is in order because I don't think we're getting the right level of engagement to get this moving without a call. So I'd like to propose that, Todd, could we get a doodle poll to just find an hour to get the members of the TSC and anyone else who'd like to join together to have this discussion?
Sure thing, no problem.
Okay, thanks. And with that, I think I don't think there's anything left on the agenda unless anyone has something they'd like to bring up.
Did we decide on the next technical face-to-face?
In the very beginning, yeah, Todd gave an update. Todd, you want to repeat that maybe? There was a couple people that asked about that in chat.
Yeah, it's looking like the Thursday and Friday in the first week of May, right after the consensus conference. We're just trying to finalize on space right now. I'm chatting with a few companies to see if someone's able to host it, and I'm hoping to close on that by end of day today and provide an update to the mailing list.
Thanks, Todd. Chris, I would like to join the next continuous integration, the tooling meeting. I'm not sure if I didn't see any meeting invite or anything like that. If you don't mind, can you?
No, it's just it's in the agenda, and it's in the agenda here, and then there's also, I think, in Slack and on the mailing list it was published.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
All right. And Todd just pasted it in the chat, so we can all share in that. All right, so then if there's nothing else, I'll adjourn the call. Thanks, everyone.